Plants need food too. Let's look into the plant nutrition. Be able to define symplast, apoplast, and mycorrhizae, both arbuscular and endomycorrhizae. Relate xylem and phloem to resource acquisition and nutrient movement. List the macronutrients. I'm looking mainly at nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and describe how plants get them from the soil as well as how plants get cations. List the roles of bacteria in nitrogen nutrition, that's the nitrogen cycle, and be able to compare types of root mutualists, relate them to the fungal and bacterial phyla. The xylem and the phloem are moving nutrients, so things are taken up in the soil and brought into the plant. Things are taken up from the air and brought into the plant. Photosynthate, the sugars produced in the leaves, needs to go to the roots, and this happens via phloem. The starch reserves from the roots may be going via phloem if they are your storage roots. Water and minerals go to the shoots via the xylem, and this helps with both photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis is above ground, and respiration is both above ground and below ground. There are ways that transport occurs between cells. The symplast happens within the cytosol, and the cytosol can control what type of sugars are moving between cells based on the size of the holes between the cells. That's right, plant cells are connected, and if you're thinking about sieve tube plates, yep, you're thinking the right thing. And if you're thinking about the companion cells next to the phloem, yes, that's also the right thing. It turns out that there are ways that plants can move sugars between them, and that is the symplastic route. There can also be the transmembrane route if sugars are dumped into the apoplast and then taken back up into the next cell. The apoplast is the dead parts of the cell, essentially the cell wall. And if you remember xylem is dead at maturity, then there's nothing left but a cell wall, and you know that xylem is exclusively apoplastic movement, whereas phloem can be symplastic, transmembrane, or technically apoplastic, but is most often symplastic. So what kind of nutrients are needed for plants? Well, we have fertilizer here, and this is just ammonium nitrate fertilizer being sprayed down. A good source of nitrogen, but not everything that is needed. How do scientists even know what plants need? Well, they know by hydroponics studies. You put two plants in two different solutions, and you can see what elements are needed by excluding these elements from one of the solutions. Essential elements are anything the plant needs to complete its life cycle and produce another generation. So if there's something that allows a plant to grow quite well, but in the absence of this nutrient, it cannot flower, well, then that is an essential element. And it is notable that not all minerals are acquired in the same quantities. There are macronutrients and micronutrients. The macronutrients are things such as carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Wait, can't a plant just get those from the air and water? Yes, it can. That's easy. Nitrogen, potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and sulfur, these have to come from the ground. And those are needed in smaller quantities than carbon dioxide and water, of course, but are still very necessary for plants to grow, as you see from this plant deficiency guide with different macronutrients missing in that plant. Micronutrients are only needed in small amounts, things like boron and chlorine. These are needed in small quantities. There's also nickel and sodium, which isn't found on the table here, which is from Pioneer seeds. Sodium's only needed in crassulacean acid metabolism plants, and we're not getting into that in any depth. And all soils are not the same. So fertilizing the soil is not the same as giving humus, the remains of dead organisms, not to be confused with humus, which, although it is made up of dead organisms, can be used as a dip. Remember, if it's humus, you can't use it as a dip. Humus, yes, dip. Humus is made of leaf litter, grass clipping, various peels and parts of plants, and humus is over a lot of time. Compost is unprocessed humus. It takes years of bacterial and fungal metabolism to turn it into true humus. So, although compost might have a lot of fertilizing capacity, you need to let your garden be fertilized for years and years on end before it truly has all of those nutrients needed. So let's compare fertilizers and compost. So I have a bag of fertilizer in my garage, and I have compost sitting in my garden. A fertilizer is balanced NPK, that's nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium for the type of growth you want. You can balance this fertilizer. You can give it more nitrogen, this causes faster growth, more potassium for disease resistance, and more phosphorus for root growth. Especially recommended here in the Pacific Northwest to give phosphorus to your lawns because it helps them grow roots before the dry season. Fertilizer can contain micronutrients or it cannot. It really depends on the fertilizer you buy. Fertilizer is sterile and it does not hold water. It dissolves in water. And fertilizer can be fast release or can be slow release. Giving too fast of a release of nitrogen to fertilizer to your plant is going to burn your plant. It actually makes it grow too fast and then it dies back. Compost, on the other hand, well, the ratio of nutrients doesn't depend on the compost you buy. It depends on what you put in it. A lot of coffee grounds are going to give a high amount of nitrogen. If you have a lot of wood ashes, that's potash or potassium, you're going to get from that. And calcium you can get from eggshells, but that's pretty slow. And this compost will contain micronutrients, basically everything you're not eating and putting in your compost. Never put meat in compost. You're going to have your micronutrients in there. Compost is bacterially alive. Very alive, fungally alive too, and often has macroinvertebrates living in it. Fun fact, if I dig up my compost, that's where I get the worms for fishing. Compost also retains water because it's made of, well, leaves and roots and other parts of plants, and those have xylem and phloem, and those take up water well. Compost is also a slower release of nutrients. Now, it should be noted that your composting rate and the size of your garden, all of these things should be taken into account, and it helps to really know what soil you're building. And if you want more gardening tips, you can contact me. Otherwise, this will be a 50-minute long video. How do plants get nutrients? Well, they can actually secrete things into the soil to help their nutrient uptake. So plants can secrete protons using proton pumps out into the water. These will bind to soil particles and cause the release of cations such as calcium and potassium, magnesium, and copper. The release of these cations allows those cations to be taken up by the root hair through the apoplastic method. So you can see how this use of these proton pumps actually increases the solubility of things. Basically, plants are pumping acid into the soil to take up nutrients and dissolve things. Nitrogen as ammonia can be taken up by ammonia transferase, and nitrogen reduction transferase can take up nitrate from the soil. Microbes are highly important in plant nutrition. It's not just an issue of simple molecule being taken up by plant. No, microbes are very active. Mycorrhizae help plants take up nutrients from the soil. These are fungi that associate with plant roots. They take carbon from the plant and give water and nutrients to the plant. And there are two types we'll look at here. Ectomycorrhizae form a sheath over the root. This is not very common in the angiosperms. Arbuscular mycorrhizae, or from the glomeromycota, are going to form hyphae that penetrate into the root cells and exchange nutrients with the plant. Very intimate connection. Bacteria are also active. Endophytes live between the cells and the roots. They don't make strong associations with the roots. They just live there and do things, and they get a home. Rhizobacteria are very closely related to the roots, however, but they live outside of the roots and just very closely associated, doing a lot of good things for the plant. Plant growth promoting bacteria are currently a new source of research of what types of species cause plants to grow faster. They aid young plant growth and are currently being researched as how you can just add PGRP, PGPB, and increase the rate of growth of Douglas fir plants, for example. Bacteria are active in the soil with nitrogen. There are nitrogen-fixing bacteria that bring N2 from the environment into the nitrogen cycle as ammonia. Ammonifying bacteria can also turn organic material into ammonium. This ammonium is taken up by nitrifying bacteria, which turn it into nitrate. They oxidize the ammonia. Ammonium can also be taken up by the root, and nitrate can be taken up by a root, and this is all good for the plants. Denitrifying bacteria can actually remove nitrogen from the rhizosphere and put it back in the atmosphere. So all of these types of bacteria are active in the soil and benefit or harm the plant. Legumes have a especially intimate connection with rhizobium bacteria. They form these nodules where bacteria fix nitrogen and receive a payment in terms of carbon. These nodules have something called leg hemoglobin. It's used to bind oxygen because nitrogen fixation is inhibited by oxygen. And if you heard hemoglobin and thought that sounds like blood, well, yes, leg hemoglobin is pink. And hemoglobin binds oxygen just like leg hemoglobin does. The leg is for legume. We're going to look at some of these unusual nutritional adaptations in class. Why don't you pop over to your book and read about some of these pretty interesting things that plants can do. And this odd one especially, we're going to cover it in class. Consider that a treat for coming to lecture.